If you had a casual friend who recently started the game and wanted to 36 star the Abyss as fast as possible, as long as they had the units for it, you would be crazy not to recommend they build a Hyperbloom team. The amount of resin and 5-star characters required, it is almost certainly the strongest team in the game by a pretty large margin. And just looking at the cast with how many characters either use Hyperbloom as their best team or at least have it as one of their strongest options, it is easy to see why many people claim that Hyperbloom ruined the game balance. Welcome to Jello Impact, where we build and test every single character to help you decide who you want to wish for and build. So I'm going to give you 5 reasons why I agree with this statement and 5 reasons why I disagree. And at the end, you can comment down below if the game is better off with or without this broken reaction. Number 1, the power you get for the resin efficiency is very unbalanced. Yes, for sure, when you're building a Hyperbloom team, such as this one, Fischl, Nahida, Singcho, Kuki, one of the more 4-star oriented Hyperbloom teams, you do need to build Fischl for damage, you're going to build Nahida for damage, you're going to build Singcho for damage. So yes, ideally you want some good artifacts for them, but the majority of the team's damage, for sure the highest damage contributor, are the Hyperblooms themselves, procced by your Electro character, and they only need EM main stats to reach basically their ceiling damage. Yes, EM main stats are very rare, but not nearly as rare as building some 200 plus crit value character along with the ER and the attack or the HP or whatever stats they need to balance. EM is basically free. And yes, Flowers of Paradise Lost or Gilded Dreams are the best sets for these types of characters, but you can easily get away with a 2-piece Gilded Dreams and 2-piece Wanderer's Troop, which you're almost definitely going to get at least one Elemental Mastery piece while farming for your Deepwood Memories for your Kuki. So the resin efficiency is just off the charts for this team. The amount of farming you need to do to get to a level to 36 star the Spiral Abyss for a Hyperbloom team is just way less than it is for any other team, except for Nilou Bloom teams, which, although not strictly a Hyperbloom team, functions on the same core principle. You have some strictly reaction-based characters that react off of EM and use Nahida, and it's essentially the same problem, is it's way too resin efficient for the damage that you get out of it when we're comparing it to other teams. The second reason is that this team has no business being this strong considering how easy it is to play. If you plug the numbers of this team into a simulator and you select random button presses, random switches, random normal attacks, charge attacks, etc., and you just randomize mashing on a keyboard, you basically put a monkey on the keyboard, this team's DPS is comparable and beats out a ton of teams in the game. Honestly, it beats out most of the cast until you get to high investment and good play. So not saying that this team randomly played will outperform, you know, a 210 crit value Hu Tao that's played properly. But if you just give a new player this team who's never played the game before, they can already do 36 star level of investment or very close. It doesn't require a ton of game knowledge, a ton of character knowledge, a ton of mechanical skill. You just plug and play, especially given that this last flex slot could be something like a Zhongli, and then you're basically invulnerable. It's a team that I will often bring out when I'm fighting a particularly annoying boss, like the Seahorse, for example. I've been struggling, I've been fighting, I've been, you know, using Bennett to break the cores, and then I just bust out the Hyperbloom team and Alhaitham beats it in, you know, less than 40 seconds or whatever. And it just feels like you're playing a different game when you understand the game and how it works. Because now I'm not saying that the team itself is way head and shoulders in its power ceiling. Don't misunderstand. Because oftentimes when more casual players, and myself included, will do something like we'll miss a swirl with our Kazuha. The enemy won't be properly affected by the element, we'll miss a swirl with our Kazuha, and then our DPS is just tanks for the next rotation. Or we'll accidentally extend a rotation by missing a skill, not having enough energy recharge, and then we'll tank our DPS again. With a team like this, there's basically no way to mess it up. There's nothing you can do. You don't have to worry about a large percentage of things that you normally have to worry about when you're playing a team. And as such, you can just go in, mash, and often come out 36 starring or at least close, no matter how bad you essentially play. Number 3, it's just too many characters best or one of their best teams. Like going through the list, the amount of characters that either work best with Hyperbloom or work best at least at low investment in Hyperbloom is ridiculous. Like Like, it's not like it's Fischl's very best team or the team where she shines the most, but it's still a team that you can just throw on there and she performs incredibly well. It's a team that Wanderer can be the 4th slotted because, and this was going to be number 4, but I'll mix it in here, because it's a 3-man core. As long as you have Nahida, Hydro, Electro, or honestly, you don't even need Nahida. This could be Baiju. This could be Dendro main character. It could be a lot of different Dendro characters, but Nahida is the best one. And as long as you have Xingqiu or Yelan, probably Farina is going to be a good option, either Raiden or Kuki. Basically, anyone can be that final slot. It could be Fischl. It could be Wanderer. It's going to be his best team when you're at low investment. It's Raiden's best team because, you know, this is one of the saddest parts for me, and I'll talk about it in a minute, but what the implications of this are. But her highest damaging team is often being an E-bot for Hyperbloom. It's one of Yelan's best teams. It's one of Wriothesley's best single target teams. Definitely it's his best team at low investment. Linny doesn't work with the team. Venti not really so much. Kazuha can, but not really. A lot of the Animo characters don't really work as well with it, but it can be good for Ayaka. Not amazing, but in certain abysses that require high single target damage, it can be a great choice. It's obviously Sino's best team. A lot of people like using Yaimiko and Keqing with it. It's Alhaitham's best team. If Tainari could proc Xingqiu or Yelan, it probably would be close, if not his best team. Maybe with Farina it happens. Nilou is not Hyperbloom, but the concept is very, very similar. It's one of Ayato's best teams. It's one of Kokomi's best teams. It basically just power creeps Yoimiya all by itself, especially at low investment. Similar thing with Hu Tao, although she doesn't need quite as much investment to come on par, but she does require a lot more skill. Is one of Sucrose's better teams. Razor, it's more of a Burgeon team, but same idea. Everything I'm saying about Hyperbloom pretty much applies to Burgeon as well, except Burgeon has a bit more drawbacks. Kave, Yao, Candace, Barbara, either they work with Nilou or they work with Hyperbloom, basically the same thing. Toma, Bennett, Zhongli. I mean, obviously Bennett doesn't work well with Hyperbloom. That's one of the reasons why they made it the way they did, so that Bennett wouldn't continue his reign of dominance. Eula, Ganyu both work with Hyperbloom. Baiju, Nouvelette, even Deia's best team is a Hyperbloom now with Nouvelette. Like, you can just see the ridiculous amounts of characters that either work best with or one of their better teams, or at least their better teams with low investment, includes Hyperbloom, because it's such a strong 3-man core. And that can be frustrating if you're trying to try out a bunch of different teams and you are at a low investment point. It gives you your choices. Either you hyper invest into a character to make them shine outside of Hyperbloom, or you just use them in Hyperbloom. And that's where I come to number 5, my final reason that Hyperbloom has ruined the game, and that's that it baits you into spending money on your other characters because they feel bad by comparison. I know. You're thinking there's no way that Hoyoverse made Hyperbloom strong so that you have to spend on your other characters to compete. But I would argue that they did. I am definitely not the only person who is kind of pissed off that Raiden's best team is now a Hyperbloom team at Constellation 0. And it doesn't matter how cracked I make her artifacts. Doesn't matter how much resin I dump to get 40 crit value pieces on as many pieces as I can. Doesn't matter how much I crown her talents. If I want to use her burst and have that be a stronger contributor to a team's damage than her skill, at least in single target, in AoE there is some argument to C0 Raiden with Kazuha being better. I'm going to have to shell out for her C2. Whether that's saving up free-to-play primos or putting up the credit card, one way or another, if I want my Raiden to compete with Hyperbloom and consistently win, I'm gonna need to get her C2. And this is not the only character that feels like this. Wanderer is a character that feels like this. If you don't either hyper invest into his artifacts or get C6 Farazan, Hyperbloom is gonna be one of his better teams. Same with Wriothesley. And I'm not, and for it's less clear for Wanderer. I'm more talking about that artifact investment. It's not really so much as Constellations or C6 Farazan, but it really, truly, if you don't have great artifacts, him as the 4th slot on a Hyperbloom team is just going to be better. And it is the same with Wriothesley. It's absolutely the case with Sino, but you know, he's kind of made for Hyperbloom, so that's sort of different. But someone like Ayato, and also characters that don't just use Hyperbloom, but they sort of compete against Hyperbloom, like Yoimiya. Your Yoimiya has to be cracked to even come close to what Hyperbloom does. It's not that she can't, but she has to be very heavily invested. And same with Hu Tao. It's not that that her ceiling teams can't even be better than a Hyperbloom teams, but you have to play well and you have to farm a lot, or you have to get her weapon or her C1. And that's just the case for a lot of characters. If you want your Eula to feel any good and to break out of that Hyperbloom driver role, you might need to shell out for some constellations. Basically, what Hyperbloom did is it raised the floor of every team. Now you can just slap any team into a Hyperbloom team and they have a baseline that they can compare against. And because the baseline is so easy to achieve, both with artifact investment and with play, it's very hard not to compare against that baseline. It's like when you finally get some 5-star weapons or some constellations for your characters, all of a sudden they're outperforming your other characters and you're like, huh, these characters are performing way better. And if you want your other characters to feel just as good, you're gonna need to shell out more resin or more primo gems to give them better artifacts, or to give them constellations and 5-star weapons to make them feel as good. And I would not be surprised at all if this was part of Hoyoverse's plan. Maybe a crackpot theory. I may be totally off on this. If you disagree, which I'm sure a ton of you will, let me know in the comments. And that's 5 reasons why it's ruining the game. Now for 5 reasons why it's not ruining the game. Number 1, it increases the amount of good team cores without making the other cores weaker. So we all complain about Hyperbloom now and how every character's best team is Hyperbloom. But this is not the first time we've had these things happen. Before this, before we had any of this, Bennett Shangling was the core that was ruining the game, that it was way stronger than everything else. Or maybe Bennett Shangling Sing Cho, the national core. Then eventually we had Bennett Kazuha, and Bennett Kazuha was the one that was basically the best core in the game and was ruining the rest of the game. And then we have Double Hydro, is Sing Cho Yalan that is ruining everything. And now we have Dendro. So now that we have all of these cores, the amount of strong, very strong cores that support and prop up a ton of other teams, there are a lot of more viable team cores out there, and that increases variety. Yes, Dendro is very strong, but it's a new strong option where before we didn't have that option. So, and I think that's a positive. Number 2, it allows relatively undertuned units to clear comfortably. If you want to clear with Chi-Chi, put her on Clam Set, put her in a Hyperbloom team. She actually has synergy and she's gonna do well. That's a pretty awesome thing. It's such a cool thing that you can now clear with your Chi-Chi. You can clear with on-field Barbara without having to invest a ridiculous amount into Vape Barbara. Or the case with other new units like Fremine. Like, yes, I would prefer that he was a physical character and he was best with physical because that's like kind of how his kit's made. But even though he's undertuned, we can still use him to clear. Hyperbloom makes that possible. This is a good thing. Number 3, it reduces anxiety. It's very easy to play, and if you're trying to get a good clear, it can be nice to have an easy to play team that can just allow you to mash your way to a 36-star clear and have fun crushing the enemy. I think that's a good thing that that option exists. Number 4, it reduces the amount of resin and farming that it takes to get a top tier team and to 36-star the Abyss. This is a very good thing for people who don't like farming a ton, and this leads me into my final and 5th point, is that it's really good for the casual meta. It's a really good bridge between players who just want to mash and who just want to play casually and they want to start pushing the Spiral Abyss just for fun or for the Primo Gems or whatever. It is really good that we have this option available to them. My wife is the shining example of this. She found the Abyss hard, not too fun, stressful to have to do the exact rotations and the exact teams and the sweaty setups. But when I set her up with her Hyperbloom team and her Bergen team for the 2 sides of the Abyss, she is having a ton of fun actually playing through the Abyss. She didn't get 36 stars. She was very close. She got 2 stars on each chamber. So she was very happy with the amount of Primo Gems. She had never done that before with her Ito team or for her child team because it just took her too much resin to farm up her Ito team. It took too much skill to get her child Shangling Kazuha double swirl setups. She just didn't want to do it. It's not that she couldn't do it, but she likes to mash and play on her phone in between looking after the kids. So she doesn't have the time to really go through all that. When she could play Hyperbloom and Bergen on either side of the Abyss, she had a ton of fun, she loved it, and she got the best clears she's ever had. It's really good for casual players. So now for my conclusion. I can see where sweaty players are coming from, such as myself. It's annoying that characters like Raiden are better off not even using their gorgeous burst animation, just being reduced to an E-bot if you're playing at C0. But it's good for the game overall because it can help the casual players catch up. The only thing I will say is the game doesn't do a great job telling you that this team even exists or that this reaction exists. It kind of leaves it all up to you to figure out, which is pretty interesting. It doesn't guide you through and show you how to build these characters properly, you do need guides, or at least someone, a friend or someone to tell you that these teams exist. Like, my wife would never have figured out Burgeon by herself. She needed someone to tell her that it exists. So even though it's good for casuals, it doesn't actually reach the casuals' ears unless they're talking to someone who knows more. So that's kind of a weird thing. I think they should do something about that. And yes, I do think that that Hyperbloom feels, and Nilou, to be honest, feels unbalanced for how little resin you need to put into it and how little skill needs to be put into playing the game with those teams. But I think that's okay. I think Genshin is at its core more of a casual friendly game. Yes, there's things you can do to take it more seriously, and we can have fun talking about meta, and some of the abysses do get really hard, and it really does require some skill and some well-built characters. But at its core, it should be approachable to casual players so that more players can come in and join the game and they can fund it more. I'm excited to see what Farina can bring, if that Hyperbloom will still reign as one of the top teams, or if Farina will open up a whole new team archetype that's very strong that will rival that of Hyperbloom. And if maybe each region a new team archetype will be added to the roster, I think that'd be really, really cool. Overall, I am happy Hyperbloom exists. I don't think it's ruining the game. I think it's good to have a casual friendly option, a low investment option, an easy to play option. I think that's a good thing. And I think in the long run, you know, if you do enjoy playing Burst Raiden, like, you can always save up for your C2. That's probably what I'll be doing eventually. But that's all for me now. Please consider subscribing if you want to see more. I just started a second channel, The Jello Show. My wife and I wished for Risley, and I put that video on the second channel, so go check that out if you want to see how our wishes went. And I also cover other anime games on this channel too, as well as the casual side of Genshin. We also have a Discord if you want to check that out and join a great community. I have a Patreon if you want to support me and my family. And if you don't want to do any of that, that is totally fine. Just watching the video has been more than enough. Thanks so much. Bye for now.